This morning we have beautiful pictures of Christ on the altar. This one of him meditating is very powerful because truly that is how we find our greatness, is through meditation. And our line of gurus have said that those seemingly lost years of Jesus were spent in India studying these teachings. And Yogananda said that there's a tradition of the way Christ left his body on the cross, a certain head movement that is very similar to one of the higher Kriyas. So he probably left consciously through that technique. This picture here that's lit is from the Shroud of Turin. And I remember discovering a picture, the negative. You know, the Shroud of Turin was what wrapped Christ's body, and so the wounds were visible on that piece of cloth, but they were sort of charged electrically, magnetically, so that it was like a negative photograph. And I remember seeing this negative photograph 30, 40 years ago, and I loved it. I had it on my altar for all those years. And then, I think in the 70s or 80s, it was supposedly debunked. And they thought, oh no, we've done carbon testing on this shroud. And it's from, I forget, some hundreds of years ago. It's not from 2,000 years ago. Well, then recently they retested, and they found that the piece they had tested before was a patch that the French nuns had put on in the 1700s. So now the Shroud of Turin is back to being real, which we always thought it was anyway. And what's happened here is that an artist has turned that negative into a positive. And so, as far as we know, this is the closest thing to Christ's features that we have. And this little picture over here, maybe you can come up after service and see it. It's what was painted by Yogananda's brother, Sananda Ghosh. So it's very nice to have that also. It's important that we tune into these great souls because they come to earth, as Swami Kriyananda would often say, not to tell us how great they are, but to show us what we can become, what our destiny is, what our birthright is. Kriyananda wrote a beautiful oratorio. The choir music that you're hearing today is all from the oratorio called Christ Lives. And Swami Kriyananda was very inspired on pilgrimage in the Holy Land, and he wrote all this beautiful music. When we did another pilgrimage some years after his first one, the choir sang in all these holy places. If you can imagine such a joy to sing in the actual church of Bethlehem, to go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, all these very holy places. It was a great blessing to sing these songs there. And what was so particularly amusing was that other big tour groups would be there with us. We were never just alone. And inevitably someone would come up and say, "Are you a famous choir?" No. But we're a choir of devotees, and I think that's what people felt, was that great devotion. Swami ended his oratorio with the words, "Thus ended and thus began the greatest story ever told. And truly, Christ's life is worth reading about, studying, and meditating on. There are so many beautiful lessons in his life. I was just remembering this Holy Week and the Last Supper that he had with his disciples. He broke bread and he said, "Eat of this. This is my body. And drink this wine. This is my blood." How can you understand that? How easy it would be to be put off by that. I don't want to eat flesh and drink blood. That's like a horror movie. Why would we want to do that? But it's a very important lesson, because these masters, these spiritual teachers, will say things that are hard to understand. I remember the first time I opened the autobiography of a yogi, somebody gave it to me. I read something and I said, "Oh, that's not for me. That's ridiculous. I know better than that." And only years later could I take it in and be open to it. Trust. Think maybe I don't know everything. Maybe try to absorb, try to understand. When we read these things, or we hear the Festival of Light, or read books, any of the teachings, there are things that we can go, "Oh, that's not right. I don't believe that." But instead, be humble. Think, well, maybe there's something to this. Let me try. Let me try to understand. And of course, what Jesus was saying is, take this bread, comes from me. It is my vibration, it's my consciousness, it's my self. Take it into yourself and become one with me. Beautiful, deep, mystical consciousness. But if you just look at it at the surface, it's easy to be afraid of it. But it's really a beautiful mysticism. So Jesus went to the Garden of Gethsemane after the Last Supper, and he asked his friends to watch and pray. And he came back. "You can't even stay awake for 1 hour and pray with me? This is like the most important culmination of my whole life. You can't even stay awake?" How often have our nearest and dearest ones not been there for us? What do? We go to the one who always is there for us. That's what Jesus did. He prayed to his Father, and what happened? An angel of the Lord came to comfort him. Don't rely on others. Rely on God. My mother was reminding me, she's 88 and she has all sorts of physical tribulations, but she was saying, remember, God says, in your weakness, my strength is made perfect. Give your weakness to God. Rely on God. In all circumstances, don't rely on anything outside of that. So Jesus was betrayed. Judas came and betrayed him with a kiss. The ultimate insult, to pretend to love and to be betrayed in that way. It's so cruel. And Jesus said to him, you will betray me with a kiss? And then there was all this commotion, and Peter ended up cutting off the ear of one of the servants in the scuffle. And what did Jesus do? He healed the man's ear. In the midst of our worst tribulations, let us think about other people and give to other people, even in the midst of being arrested. Jesus cared about others. And he was thrown up against the Sanhedrin and then Pontius Pilate. No due process of law, no justice. He was beaten, he was scourged, he was laughed at, ridiculed, wrapped in a purple robe with a crown of thorns stuck on his head. All of that agony he foresaw in the Garden of Gethsemane. He wasn't just placidly praying. He was in an agony. It was the agony of the garden. Luke, in the Gospel of Luke, said that he sweat blood. This is a phenomenon that can happen when there's intense stress, intense agony of spirit. So it's not as though Jesus didn't know what was coming and didn't dread that. He sweat blood over it. But then when he said to God, "Not my will, but thy will be done. Let this cup pass from me, but if not, thy will be done." And then, from then on, he was centered through the whole thing. Nothing ruffled him. He didn't cry out. He didn't say, "This is completely unfair. I didn't receive a trial. I didn't, nobody, I demand a lawyer." He didn't do any of that. He went forward with complete faith in God. And even hanging on the cross, his thought was, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." Can you put yourself in that position? Put yourself in the trials that we have in our lives. What do we do? Can we forgive people? Can those who have betrayed us, can we just forgive them? And Jesus left his body, and as he had said before, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will rebuild it." In Matthew it talks about when the angel moved the stone away from the tomb, there was an earthquake, and many souls who were dead walked forward. Not only did Jesus bring life back to his beaten body, the life cells, the life force, the energy, the magnetism, whatever you want to say, must have been so powerful that it not only brought him back to life, but other souls came forth from their tombs and were seen in the town. And he was so transfigured that his own disciples didn't even recognize him. He walked with 2 of them to an adjacent town, talking to them the whole way, and they didn't even recognize them until he sat and broke bread with them again, and they realized it was the Lord. Have there been times when you've walked with Jesus and you didn't even know it? There are angels among us. God speaks to us through our friends, through strangers, through books. God is speaking to us. God is with us. And this incredibly dramatic story was not to put God up on a pedestal, Christ up on a pedestal where we can never reach, but to tell us that we can overcome we can triumph even over death, as Jesus did. Our job is to magnetize, to purify, to strengthen our body, mind, and soul so that we can ascend to heaven just as he did. In all the trials of our lives, think of how Jesus reacted. Think of how he behaved, what he did, and try to emulate that. In the worst circumstances of people yelling and commotion, think of Jesus healing that servant's ear. See what you can do just to give peace and compassion in the midst of chaos. Think what you can do to forgive. After Jesus was resurrected, he met with the disciples and he said to Peter, "Do you love me?" And Peter said, "You know I love you, Lord." He asked him a second time, "Do you love me?" "Yes, I love you, Lord. You know I do." And a third time, "Do you love me?" "Yes, Lord." And Peter knew that the 3 times he had betrayed Christ, he was forgiven because Jesus asked him to tell him he loved him 3 times. And Jesus smiled at him and said, "Feed my sheep." Our mistakes, our triumphs, all serve us so that we can serve others. Take whatever you have been given of joy, of peace, of divine love, and give that to others. And you will honor Christ and his consciousness within you.
It's very common for people to think of Christ's suffering as a personal event, a personal drama. And of course, Christ had this human side. He walked around in a body for a reason. But really, I believe what was happening was he was suffering in a human way because an awful lot of karma was getting worked out on his body for the benefit of his disciples and for the benefit of the world, to the degree that the world was able to tune in, which frankly wasn't huge. But the disciples would have received tremendous benefit from that. And it's interesting to reflect. I don't know that he really explained to them what was happening in that moment. Obviously, the Last Supper was a momentous occasion, and obviously it was a little unusual. And yes, he was dropping hints left and right that I think they maybe picked up afterwards. But he was saying at the Last Supper, "I do this in remembrance of me," in reference to the bread and the wine. And he was also saying, "I will not be having another one of these," so hello, wake up. But on the night of, at the critical moment there in the Garden of Gethsemane, I don't know that he had explained to them, "You really need to stay with me. This is like really, really important." Mm-hmm. And they faded off and dropped away to rest. But his awareness in that moment was wanting to be perfectly in tune with God's will, wanting to let that will flow perfectly through him. And if you think of your life, I remember when I was in 7th and 8th grade, I took Spanish, and there was the technology, the very cutting edge technology of the time, was we all sat at these desks that had headphones that could be plugged in, and you plugged them in, and you had a little mouthpiece that came in front of you, sort of like what you might see people in call centers using, and So the teacher would say something and we would have to say that, or we would respond, or we would read something, or we would answer questions in Spanish. All of us in the room talking at the same time. We all had our headphones on. The trick was the teacher could listen to you specifically. Teacher could listen to the whole class, could listen specifically to you, specifically to the next person, to every single person in the room specifically, but you never knew when. So you had to just stay with it. There was no sort of waiting to the critical moment. Oh, she's listening. I better get it together now. Better get it exactly right now. No. Because you really couldn't tell. She warned us in the beginning, you will not be able to tell. There will be no sound that indicates, I am now listening to you. Stay with it. Well, in the Garden of Gethsemane, around the fire, when Peter's being challenged by these various people saying, I thought you were with him. Weren't you with him? Didn't I see you? Weren't you guys all together? And Peter had made this big pronouncement earlier, because Christ had said, I will suffer. This is going to happen. And Peter's saying, I would go to prison with you. I would even die with you. And then a little while later, oops, didn't know him. I don't know him, not with him. That just means his own energy dropped enough that he became personal. He thought, I have to protect myself. This is a very odd situation, a very unpredictable situation. I have to protect myself. If you can put rationale around it. All of us at one time or another have not made it to the mark that we were shooting for. That's a given in this lifetime. There's always going to be something where we didn't quite hit the mark. But that presence of Christ, given as an example, and I want to just reemphasize something Nirmala said. He did not come to show us so high, so impossibly perfect of a mark, that we could never reach it or meet it. In fact, earlier in the Bible, Christ says, be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. He's not mincing words. He's not saying, just be sort of a nice person sometimes. Yeah. You were speeding that one time, but, whatever. No, he says, be ye therefore perfect, for heaven's sakes. Which is to say, that's a potential. That is a potential for us to reach. We follow his example, and we wonder to ourselves maybe, how could someone go through the experience that he did and be as centered as he was? And I have a theory about that, and it's based on the meditation that we had here yesterday. We do 2 all-day meditations in a year, one before Christmas and one before Easter. And yesterday was the one before Easter, and it was magnificent. And I am convinced now, I suppose I would have theoretically been convinced in other years, but I'm convinced now that he comes every time to one of those meditations. He comes to people. He doesn't necessarily come in physical form. Maybe someone had that experience. It's not like we all sat around and shared what our experiences were. But I know that he comes. And he comes in stillness. And the calmness that he could manifest in the face of all of this commotion, all the suffering, all the ridicule, all the everything that was going against him, he stayed in stillness. He responded from stillness. Master had a beautiful way of putting this in terms of our life, how to live our lives. He said, be calmly active and actively calm. That represents stay with the stillness of Christ. Stay with the stillness of meditation that you've gained, that you've harvested, that you've saturated yourself with. In the act of communion that Christ gave to the disciples, he's saying, eat this bread. It is my body. It is my body of consciousness. It is my awareness. It is my infinity. Take and consume that. Feast on it. Become one with it. This is my blood, the wine. Drink of it. Become one with that infinite consciousness that flows through all creation. Know that his reality is your reality. No one can give that to you. No one can strike you with lightning and suddenly you know. You have to want to know. You have to make yourself so magnetic that the lightning will strike you that will help you to know. Otherwise it doesn't come. We have to ourselves worship that Christ in the stillness. And then, yes, he does come. And then we learn how to get through the Spanish class, how to be on all the time. By the way, I wasn't all that great at that at the time. It was my first D in school, was my first semester in Spanish class. I didn't do so great, and didn't score very many marks at home either when I brought home a D. But Peter didn't score very good marks on Good Friday morning either, early. He probably didn't even get all the way up to a D with betraying Christ 3 times or denying Christ 3 times. But all of us, in one way or another, that perfection lives in us. We have to find it. We have to want it. We have to call to it. Cloud-colored Christ, come. Oh my Christ, Jesus Christ, come. We call to that presence within us, not as some distant memory lost in history, but because he lives. He lives here and now. Swamiji named the oratorio, Christ Lives. Christ lives in the Holy Land and in you as the subtitle, but he lives. And once you know that life, once you feel that life, you will know it as your very own. It won't be something from history. It will be your life because you've walked the walk that he lived. You will know that walk step by step by step. Your circumstances will be different outwardly, but your consciousness will be the same. Reaching toward that infinity. Know that that truth lives for you, and he lived for you. He lived for all of us. Let us live for him as well. Namaste.